good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Christiana Mertens, Deputy Director at NAAEE. Thank you so much for joining us today for this February installment of our monthly webinar series. Today's webinar will be presented by Angela Mooney D'arcy, the founder and executive director of Sacred Places, the Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, presenting Decolonizing Environmental Education, Building Relationships with Indigenous Peoples. Each month, a number of NAAEE's affiliate organizations join us to help co-host these webinars. We're so grateful for this partnership as it has allowed us to reach more people and expand our audience through the network. Big thanks to the affiliates who are co-hosting today's webinar with us, and you are represented on this slide. So, welcome to NAAEE's monthly webinar series. To give you just a little more info, we host webinars normally on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 3 p.m. But because the internet basically broke on Tuesday, we did have to shift to today. So thank you so much for your patience and for your flexibility for joining us today. In each webinar, we will highlight areas of key interest to environmental education professionals that will help bring new ideas and thinking to our work, showcase thought leaders working in EE and other related disciplines, and help to improve practice and quality in our field. We absolutely welcome you to put forth recommendations of topics you'd like us to cover. Our next webinar will be a two-parter on Tuesday and Wednesday, March 28th and 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Andy Goodman will present Why Bad Presentations Happen to Good Causes. Definitely a webinar not to miss. And a huge shout out to Kristen Kunkel. She is on the NAAEE team and also the genius behind our webinar series, and you'll be hearing from her after Angela's presentation. And before I keep going, another big shout out to Sai Mudasani on the team for managing the social media and communications aspect of the team. Ladies are amazing. All right, so let's talk about a little housekeeping. For today, we're going to, after this introduction, we will hear from Angela, and at the end of the presentation, we will open it up for questions and discussion, and then we'll wrap it up with a few final thoughts. And if we can't get to everyone's questions today, there will certainly be an opportunity to follow up. All right, and a few more things. All of your participant audio lines are muted, but of course, we still want to hear from you. So feel free to comment in or ask questions at any time using the chat box. Navigate to the black toolbar at the top of your screen, and by clicking chat, this will prompt the chat box to appear on the screen. You can send a message to the whole group or just the panelists by using the drop-down menu at the bottom of the chat box. And we'll be keeping an eye on the chat as Angela goes through her presentations to take note of any incoming questions. So now to introduce our speaker, Angela Mooney D'arcy. You guys are really in for a treat. I have had the pleasure of getting to know Angela through our work together on the Environmental Professionals of Color chapter here in Los Angeles. Angela she's an extraordinary woman. She is a force to be reckoned with, a game changer and inspiration, and just an amazing human being. Angela is of the Wanyano Band of Mission Indians, a Hashiman Nation. Angela is from the Native Nation whose traditional territories include the area now known as Orange County. We've been working with Native nations, Indigenous people, grassroots and nonprofit organizations, artists, educators, and educational institutions on environmental and cultural justice issues for over 15 years. She is the executive director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, a Los Angeles-based Indigenous-led community organization and affiliate of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, dedicated to building the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. She is a co-founder of the United Coalition to Protect Panhe, a grassroots alliance of Ahashiman people dedicated to the protection of the sacred site Panhe. Angela also authored the environmental justice chapter of the report Native Voices Rising, a case for funding Native-led change, which was sponsored by Native Americans in Philanthropy and Common Council Foundation. She serves as board secretary for the Blas Aguilar Adobe Museum and Ahashiman Cultural Center in San Juan Capistrano, and is a recipient of the New Voices Fellowship, a National Forward Foundation funded program dedicated to cultivating the next generation of social justice leaders, and the Earth Justice Sutherland Fellowship, awarded each year to a recent law school graduate to continue their work in environmental public interest law. She received her BA from Brown University and her JD with a concentration in critical race studies and focus on federal Indian law from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Angela, and I will kick it over to you.
Hi, am I off mute? I guess
Yep,
I'm off mute.
good.
Okay. Hi, thank you for that amazing introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to do this webinar. I am incredibly excited and grateful for the opportunity. I think that we need to decolonize everything and everyone and everywhere, but particularly when it comes to the topic of environmental education, that's sort of the heart and soul where I believe that decolonizing needs to happen in terms of ways to move forward and build effective and meaningfully engaged relationships with Indigenous peoples. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I like to start sometimes with this quote from Joy Harjo, who some of you may know is a pretty renowned Indigenous poet. I think that at the heart of a lot of the conflicts between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples really does focus on a misunderstanding and a difference of opinion in terms of what land means. And so Joy, as a poet, I think does an excellent job in this quote of highlighting some of that difference. So she says, what especially makes Indigenous cultures unique is the relationship to the land. Land is a being, an entity, a repository of meaning. There's an ongoing relationship with the land. It's the keeper of our bones, stories, and songs. In this manner of thinking and being, there is no hierarchy to differentiate value between all living things. And as we'll see as we go through my presentation, these themes of land as a family member with whom one has a relationship, and this notion of non-hierarchical ways of being, you'll see those themes emerge throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So to start us out, I want to sorry, I confused myself because I'm looking at a different screen on my other computer. So for today's webinar, I want to start out by locating ourselves, and then we'll go into defining some key terms, because I will be using terms that maybe aren't in the common lexicon, like settler colonialism and white supremacy and things like that. So we'll go through some terms, and then I want to spend the bulk of our time today talking about the history of Native American and settler colonial relationships, and also this concept of intersectionality, which some of you may have learned from Kimberly Crenshaw's work. She's a critical race theorist and a lawyer, and the term intersectionality arises out of a seminal work that she did in critical race theory called Mapping the Margins, which is about the lived experience of women of color as women of color. And the point of that concept is pretty much that you can't disaggregate one piece of a person's identity from another. That when people experience racism, when they experience misogyny, when they experience homophobia, it is their entire personhood that experiences that, and that we need to, in the interest of moving forward in a positive way together, make sure that we're honoring and acknowledging all the different pieces that make up people, and how our systems of institutional racism and sexism can intersect and create layers of oppression. So we can go on to the next slide. So I want to talk first about locating ourselves. And since I'm based in Los Angeles, California, I want to start with what's appropriate protocol in Indigenous cultures, which is to make sure that you acknowledge the Native nations whose lands and territories on which you live and work. And so for me, I live in Los Angeles, which is in the ancestral homelands of the Tongva Nation. And so I'd like to thank the Tongva people for allowing me to give this talk today here in my home. And when I teach at University of California, Riverside, and I've been teaching there for about 6 years now. In that time, I've taught probably a couple thousand students. And I begin every class, as I just begun now, by acknowledging whose ancestral lands I live and work on. What I started to do pretty early on in my teaching career, though, is I modified that a bit because I realized that so few people actually have any understanding of whose native lands they're on, that I felt there was another approach we needed to take for this kind of learning. So I start now my classes by asking students to raise their hand and tell me if they know whose ancestral lands on whom they live and work. And you know what inevitably happens is there maybe are one or two people in a classroom of 100 to 200 people that raise their hands. And then the second question that I ask is, raise your hand if you're familiar with the concept of manifest destiny. And what invariably happens then is almost everyone in the classroom raises their hand. And so what I say then as a third point is, it's no accident that you all are familiar with the second concept, but you don't know whose ancestral land you're on, because those two concepts are very much related. This concept of manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery, which I'll get to in more depth in a little bit, is directly tied to the erasure of Indigenous peoples and Native nations. And so I bring that to the table because I don't want folks to feel bad or discouraged if when I said this first question, if you don't actually know whose lands you're on. For everybody that's here on this webinar, it's no accident, for you either if you don't have that information, because this is the project of settler colonialism and manifest destiny. So as I said, I'm based in California, and so I put the map of California up there. You'll see many people, when they see this map, are very surprised because they have no idea that there's this many Native nations still living, existing, and thriving in California. In California, there are 111 federally recognized Native nations and about 50 unrecognized Native nations. So we have 160, 170 Native nations altogether. And then the map on the right-hand side of the screen is a Tribal Nations map. Now this map is pretty amazing because it was put together by an Indigenous cartographer out of Oklahoma. I'll provide after the webinar a link to that actual map, because you can expand the map and so you can see really clearly each Native Nation's territory named in its own tribal language. And so this map is very significant and political for those reasons. So I'll make sure to have that available after the talk. And the main point to remember here is just what it says on the slide, is that no matter where we travel in California or throughout the United States and even the world, we're traveling through some Indigenous communities' traditional territories. Next slide, please. So now I want to go into defining key terms. First, what do we mean when we say Indigenous people? And this definition, I wouldn't necessarily exclude Indigenous folks from Europe here. I think that the Indigenous communities in what's now known as Europe were colonized very early on in the process. And so there are still remnants of those cultures there today. But in general, what we mean when we talk about Indigenous peoples in an international context is populations who reside in lands that have been colonized by Europe and before those colonists arrived. So, the next definition I have here is Native American or American Indian. And I want to speak to a minute because I often get questions from folks wanting to know what's the proper term to call American Indians or Native people. And my answer is always, it just depends on people's preference. I, choose to identify by my tribal affiliation, which is a Hashiman. Most Native people that I know will identify by their Native Nation affiliation before any sort of pan-Indian identification. But in general, I think that the best thing to do is just ask. If people are, if you're concerned about misidentifying someone or using the wrong term, I think in general, if you just ask and you're coming at it with a good heart, people will be responsive to that, and it's not a bad thing to just ask. But in general, you can use Native American, American Indian, Indigenous, or the Native Nation from which someone comes. And now I want to move into this concept of a place-based worldview, which gets back to the first slide I showed, the quote from Joy Harjo, talking about the meaning of land from an Indigenous context. And so in this article, and I encourage you to download the article from Glenn Coulthard, which is available for free online. You can just Google the title of the article, Place Against Empire. And it's an excellent article. It's short. I think it's about 6 pages. But I think he does an incredible job of getting into the distinctions between Indigenous worldview on land and more Western view on land and place. So land is translated in relational terms. And again, that goes back to what I said previously about land as a family member, as an entity with whom one has relationships. So it's important to remember when we're talking about land that we're not just talking about physical place, but we're talking about people, animals, plants, bodies of water, adamant and inanimate objects. Ethically, this means that humans held certain obligations to the land, animals, and plants. And then you see I have listed here a story called that he refers to as the hunter and the raven story from his culture, the Dene culture. So the story that he shares in this article is a story of a hunter who was struggling to find enough food to feed his family. And what he did is use traditional ecological knowledge, which I'll refer to later in the talk. And what he did, what their tribal community would do is pay attention to the ravens to see where they could find food. A raven obviously has a bird's eye view, that's where the term comes from, and so they can see into the forest what a person can't see, or what someone limited to land can't see. And so the raven would work in collaboration with the hunter. The raven would identify where there was a wounded animal or an animal that the hunter could hunt, and then circle back to the hunter. And so the hunter would find the animal and kill the animal. And the important point of that story is that when the hunter succeeded and killed the animal to give food to his family, he made sure to leave some meat behind for the raven. And he did that because, as the quote says, without the bird, he wouldn't have killed any meat that day. So Glenn Coulthard tells this story to illustrate this relationship of reciprocity between all living things and between the land and the environment and the people. And he says the moral of that story is that if these obligations were met, then the land, animals, plants, and lakes would reciprocate and meet their obligations to humans, thus assuring the survival and well-being of all over time. When you get down to it, this is really a principle and an ethic of sustainability. So what you'll notice, the more you learn about Indigenous cultures and the more you learn about concepts like traditional ecological knowledge, is that what Western science and environmental movements are doing today is pretty much a reflection of what Indigenous peoples have been doing for thousands of years or since time immemorial. And I think it's really critical when we're talking about environmental education to remember that Indigenous peoples were the first environmental stewards, and that there's a lot of knowledge and history and information and advice that we can get by engaging directly with Native nations, with the first people from this land. Next slide. So now we get into quite a lot of content here. These are big terms, and so I want to spend a little time going over them. So we have the concept of doctrine of discovery, which is essentially the Western European Christian principle that justified the appropriation and theft of Indigenous land and the slaughter of Indigenous peoples. So for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples lived free in their territories in the Western Hemisphere. When European monarchies invasively arrived in the Western Hemisphere during the so-called Age of Discovery, they claimed the lands, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples. So the doctrine of discovery is the key premise for non-Indigenous government claims to legitimacy and sovereignty over Indigenous lands and territories. it's particularly important to note that former British colonies, specifically Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, are some of the main nation states that utilize this principle of doctrine of discovery. That's significant to note, and some of you listening in may already be aware of this fact, that those are the 4 nations that were the last to sign on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when we're talking about doctrine of discovery, even though we're talking about principles that are several hundred years old, it's critical to remember in the context of this conversation about how we engage effectively with Native nations and Indigenous peoples, that these principles are still very much in play today. And in fact, they form the root of present day property law in the United States and in those other countries that are mentioned. And we'll get in a few slides down to more specifics on the doctrine of discovery. But I also wanted to talk briefly about the concepts of colonialism and settler colonialism. So colonialism, and there are many definitions for these terms. So these are just, some that I use so that we could all be in the same sort of space in terms of working definitions. So colonialism is the involuntary exploitation of or annexation of lands and resources previously belonging to another people, often of a different race or ethnicity, or the involuntary expansion of political hegemony over them, often displacing partially or completely their prior political organization. Settler colonialism is an imposed structure rather than an historical event. And I think that's a really critical piece to remember, because when we're talking about settler colonialism, we're not talking about something that happened a long time ago and now is finished. We're talking about something that's structural, in the same way that white supremacy and racism are structural and institutional. Settler colonialism is also structural and institutional. And what that means in terms of a conversation about decolonizing environmental education is that we have to look at dismantling systems. Every single one of us as an individual could make a commitment to not being a settler colonist, to not engaging in that way of thinking, and we still wouldn't have successfully decolonized. Because in order for that decolonization to happen, you need to dismantle the actual systems and structures that form the basis for that ideology. So it's also important to note that the structure is characterized by relationships of domination and subjugation that became woven throughout the fabric of society and even can become disguised as benevolence. The object of settler colonialism is always the acquisition of indigenous territories and resources. And this means consequently that the native people must be eliminated. And that's an important theme that you'll see throughout this conversation as well, the elimination or erasure of indigenous peoples. And when we talk at the end about decolonizing environmental education, I'm hoping that you'll see that one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that you're not complicit in the erasure of indigenous peoples, and that as environmental educators, you're actively engaged in the process of decolonization via uplifting indigenous peoples and not perpetuating erasure. Next slide, please. So now you have these concepts of doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. Doctrine of discovery was basically formed in the papal bulls put out by Pope Nicholas in 1452. And in those papal bulls, he directed the king to capture, vanquish, and subdue the pagans and other enemies of Christ, and to put them into perpetual slavery and to take all the possessions and property. So, like I said, that was the ideological justification for the genocide and land appropriation. If we can pull up, or actually, let me talk about manifest destiny for a moment first. So manifest destiny is an American concept that has its roots in this notion of the doctrine of discovery and land appropriation. And manifest destiny is the belief that the United States has some unique moral virtues that other countries do not possess. The idea that the United States has a mission to redeem the world by spreading democracy, and that the US has a divinely ordained destiny to accomplish these tasks. I think that we can look at many things that the United States does around the world, and you can see this ideology embedded in a lot of the rhetoric that that politicians and folks wanting to justify oppression use. If we can pull up the graphic from the loss of Indian land now, that would be great. So this map is a pretty simple map, but it just, I think it's powerful because I think, one, it illustrates that this overarching concept that I began with, which is that all land that's now the United States is indigenous land. And you can see how quickly and fully the land of indigenous peoples was divested. The parts that are in red at the end are what indigenous peoples are left with after the divestment of land. So we can move on to the next slide now. So the next slide is the elements of doctrine of discovery. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on these elements. I think it's just useful to have them in there for folks to reference. But there's a couple of these elements that I want to go over because they relate really explicitly to decolonizing environmental education. So quickly to go through these, you have first discovery and actual occupancy. So if you recall from the previous slide talking about the doctrine of discovery, remember the justification for theft of land was it's okay to take land from people who are so-called savages, who are not Christian and not European. And so first discovery basically is the same concept that I think many of us who go through the US education system experience when we learn about Columbus. People often talk about Columbus, quote unquote, discovering America. And the reality is that he didn't discover anything. There were hundreds of thousands, millions of indigenous peoples living on this continent long before Columbus ever got here. But that concept that probably many of you experienced in learning about Columbus growing up of first discovery is very much traced back to that doctrine of discovery, in that they mean first discovery by European Christian. And so that was the concept that justified sort of the planting of flags and the fighting between European colonial powers over land grabs in the United States. So that moved from first discovery to actual occupancy, meaning that the European nation claiming title over land had to then actually occupy the land. And, you know, the preemption of European title and Indian title is to say that as this process evolved in the United States and in the Americas, it was, again, you know, fighting from European nation to European nation, and Indian title was subsumed under that. Tribal sovereignty and commercial rights just refers to the U.S. Constitution and the Commerce Clause and mentions of Native nations in the U.S. Constitution. Contiguity means that the nations claiming title over land had to have a continuous border over the lands that they're claiming title. The next concept is the concept that I want to focus most on, which is this concept of terra nullius. And terra nullius means empty land. This is really going to be really important to remember when we talk in a little bit about the creation of the U.S. National Park System. And I think now that you've heard this term terra nullius, you'll notice it everywhere. When you watch Western movies, when you see posters, when you, read articles about history, because really the concept of terra nullius is the concept of erasure of indigenous peoples. It's the myth of the empty land. It's the myth of the vanishing Indian. Many of you may have heard of Edward Curtis, who was a famous photographer in the 1800s. His goal was to capture the quote-unquote vanishing Indians on camera before they all disappeared. I can go to any university library today and find some book that says the last Juanino died in 1800 or the last Chumash person. It's almost humorous, except it's not humorous because it's about the ongoing erasure of indigenous peoples. But so this concept of empty land is very much is very, very present in the establishment of the national park system. And it's also very present, I think, in a lot of environmental education that happens around the country. And so we'll talk about that more at the end when we get to how do we go from this point to meaningful and effective engagement with Native nations. In terms of the last 3 points, the point on conquest as an element of doctrine of discovery is important to note that there need not be any actual conquest involved for European title to prevail. At that point in time, it was enough for a European nation to just show up and claim the land. And essentially, when you look at US property law, they equated showing up with conquest, meaning by virtue of European presence in a place, it meant that the Native people had been conquered. And again, we talk about the Christianity as an element of, righteous ability to hold title to land. And then civilization as well. Only civilized were justified in holding land. And the point about civilization is important as well, because one of the justifications for divestment of Indian title to land was based on this notion of proper use. How are people using the land? Is it being used appropriately? Is it being used efficiently? Very Western European concepts. And so indigenous uses of land and indigenous ideologies around sustainability were really devalued and were considered uncivilized. So we can go on to the next slide there. That's a lot of academic information, but I think it's useful to think of these terms. And again, as I said, I think throughout your work, you'll find that you'll notice these concepts more coming up in just many different areas of your work. So we can go on to, oh, I confused myself again. I'm looking at the wrong slide. So many of you have probably seen this American Progress painting, which is sort of at the heart of this concept of manifest destiny. And you can see, the angel there above high, and there's the Indians in the background leaving, and there's the wagon trains going to settle the West. So again, this notion of American exceptionalism was that these new Americans were God's new chosen people. And the whole continent of North America appears to be destined by divine providence to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religion and political principle, and accustomed to one general tenor of social usage and customs. Essentially, that's a fancy way of saying everyone was supposed to assimilate to this particular idea of what culture was supposed to be about. We can, let me note that this is all from an article called Manifest Destiny and the Environmental Impacts of Westward Expansion, which is an excellent article and one of the only ones that I've seen that really explores in depth the environmentally devastating impacts of westward expansion and colonialism on the land. So I encourage you to look up that article, and I think you'll get a lot out of it if you want to read it at a later point. So we can go on to the next slide. So again, manifest destiny is rooted in this concept of doctrine of discovery. And this is a quote from Walter Echohawk in his book, In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 Worst Indian Law Decisions Ever Decided. That's another excellent book to read that really gets into the history of the divestment of Indian land and just the subjugation of indigenous people in the United States and the massive violation of human rights that has occurred since colonization. So the elements of manifest destiny, as I mentioned earlier, are American exceptionalism, that it's America's mission to remake the world in our image, and that this is a divinely ordained right endorsed by God. So we can go on to the next slide. So now I want to juxtapose that against indigenous ways of thinking and being. So you'll note tribal sovereignty. Our nations are sovereign because we've existed here on these lands since time immemorial. So sovereignty isn't something that's granted by a settler colonial government. It's something that's inherent to Native nations. And you'll note that the circle on the top says our creation stories signify our relationship to particular places and the rights and responsibilities that stem from this relationship, including environmental stewardship and preservation for future generations. So this concept of the seventh generation is very much rooted in Indigenous land principles. So you'll notice you go through the circle to the right that these inherent rights were suppressed by the imposition of colonial, legal, religious, and cultural systems. Sovereignty, to some extent, was affirmed by the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and a series of cases decided by the Supreme Court in the 1800s. So those cases are known as the Marshall Trilogy. And the Marshall Trilogy essentially held that Native nations are domestic dependent nations, meaning the court system and the US government recognize that our sovereignty is inherent and is outside of the system of the United States. However, those Marshall decisions severely limited tribal sovereignty because they also held that through this concept of domestic dependency, that Native nations were dependent upon the US government, and that in fact, Native nations were wards of the state to whom the US owed a duty of care. And I think that reflects back to this concept of paternalism that we'll see underscores a lot of the early interactions and even some contemporary interactions between Native nations and settler colonial governments. So, but even with that domestic dependent nation status, you see that it does allow for tribal cultural resource and environmental regulatory authority on tribal lands. And that as a result of this, tribal nations are developing extensive environmental and cultural protection programs using combinations of traditional teachings and written regulations and codes. And so I think it's important to highlight that because when you're talking about Native nations, and that's why I use the term nation, you are actually talking about a separate government with separate laws and rules and jurisdiction over land. And the other piece of that that's important to remember is these governments we're talking about are governments that have a far more extended relationship and history with the land and place than the settler colonial government that has displaced us. We can go on to the next slide now. So tribal sovereignty, to give you a bit of a definition on that. Tribal sovereignty is the right or power that comes from itself and no other source that a government draws upon to govern. The United States courts have reasoned that tribes, by dint of their existence since time immemorial, prior to the inception of the other two U.S. sovereigns, must derive their authority to govern from their own sovereignty. The legal significance of the U.S. recognition of tribal sovereignty is that federally recognized tribes are able to assert civil and criminal jurisdiction over tribal lands. Although this jurisdiction has been classified and limited in certain instances, tribes retain the right to establish rules and regulations pertaining to tribal lands. So again, I just wanted to give a bit of a working definition on that term. We can go on to the next slide. So now let's get into the history of Native American settler colonial relationships and land appropriation by the United States. You can recall back to the map that I just showed you. U.S. appropriation of tribal lands and policies of forced removal have created a situation where many culturally and historically important lands are outside of tribal control. This is important in terms of environmental education because many of the sacred sites many of the places that are sacred to tribes are outside of their tribal jurisdiction. They're either privately owned or owned by the federal, state, or local government, meaning that to engage effectively with Native nations, it's really going to mean often supporting Native nations' access to sacred sites and their capacity to protect these places. And I think that the next quote is pretty startling just in terms of sheer quantity. Over the past centuries, non-Indians have acquired title to nearly 2 billion acres of land in the United States that was once controlled by American Indians. So we can move on to the next slide. These next few slides come from a book that I encourage all of you to read if you have the time. It's called Dispossessing the Wilderness, Indian Removal and the Making of National Park System. He does a really thorough job of getting into how Native nations were divested from these lands. And, you know, a lot of this stuff really came up last year, a couple of years ago, when the National Park System was celebrating its centennial. Because, you know, a piece of that, of celebrating that history also has to be being accountable to what that history actually was. So what one thing that's important out of this book is this idea that for the most part, Western conservationist concepts of wilderness again erase Native people. So you have this concept of terra nullius from the doctrine of discovery emerging again here. For the most part, these romantic visions of primordial North America have contributed to a widespread cultural myopia that allows the late 20th century Americans to ignore the fact that national parks recently enshrine recently dispossessed landscapes. So we can go on to the next slide. Now, some of this is changing. So this quote from the book says, in the rare instances that park literature mentions Indians, they tend to assume the unthreatening guise of visitors. I do think that there's been a lot of effort recently from national and state parks to be more accountable to the telling of history. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue this process of decolonizing through the national and state park system. But again, you have this concept of terra nullius and the myth of the empty land emerging in the creation of the national park system. The legacy of this ideology impacts Native people today, including the rights and needs of Native people to maintain cultural distinctiveness through the exercise of treaty rights and the practice of certain skills that can only take place in national park setting. While culturally distinct and with radically different ideas about wilderness in place, Indians and non-Indians have both looked on national parks as crucial to their political, cultural, and even spiritual identity. So I put that quote in there to remind us that even though it can seem daunting when we're examining and unpacking this history of settler colonialism, we do all have a stake in this, particularly now at this time and place. We all have a stake in protecting the remaining areas of wilderness and national parks. We can go on to the next slide. So I think also I would encourage you all to read some of these articles that came out, I said, in the last couple of years around, let's really unpack and examine the origins of the conservation movement. Many conservationists still believe that they are uniquely endowed with the foresight and expertise to control and manage so-called wilderness, and that everyone else must leave, including those who actually own and have lived there for generations. I was just on the phone with someone yesterday who was telling me that there's an engagement with local tribes here in Los Angeles on particular pieces of land, and they're being overruled by Western academic scientists in terms of what the best practices are for use of that land. So these kinds of concepts that are rooted in an earlier time of racism and eugenics, again, they're structural and they're institutional, and so we still see them emerging even today. We can go on to the next slide. And then I put in this quote about John Muir because, you know, he's oft quoted as and uplifted as this amazing environmentalist. But again, I think that if we're serious about decolonizing environmental education, we really have to come to grips with what this history is about. And so this is just a quote from Muir, who said when he said some really offensive things about Black people and Native people in an essay in 1901. And that's from an article, Environmentalism's Racist History, that came out in 2015. And I think it's an excellent article to read that kind of gets into some of that stuff. We can go to the next slide. So now we're going to move on to sort of talking about where do we go from here. And this article by Beth Rose Middleton, it's a bit old, but she's continued her work in this concept of decolonizing place via uplifting and empowering Indigenous peoples. And so again, I wanted to highlight this trauma that exists. Control and resistance are inscribed in the environment and in institutions and environmental governance. All groups are subject to regulations upon their access to the environment, but the historically violent way in which the Maidu were separated from free access to their homelands, and the way in which this separation is reinforced by institutions today, results in trauma. This trauma manifests in part in the lack of Maidu access to their environment and in the condition of the environment without Maidu stewardship. So I think this is specific to one Native nation in California, but I think it's applicable to Native nations and their experience with settler colonialism throughout the country. The trauma's there because Native peoples can't always access their sites of significance. And the trauma is also there if we get back to this concept of reciprocity and land as a living entity. The environment suffers without that when that relationship is severed. So it's not just Indigenous people that suffer when that relationship is severed. It's the land and the environment that suffer as well. So we can move on to the next slide. So Beth Rose in her article talks about this concept of soul wounds, which is the ancestral wounding that occurs in the community and that is passed down through generations. And she's speaking of the Maidu here, talking about the accounts they gave of the genocide that occurred in that area and explained how the earth had been wounded as well. And when the earth is wounded, the people who are the caretakers of the earth are also wounded. I think if any of you have been following what's been happening at Standing Rock, this principle of soul wound and what's been happening there is clearly illustrated. And again, in talking about trauma, it manifests as a lack of access to sacred sites, inability to protect sacred sites and burials, lack of access to gathering sites and ceremonial sites, lack of access to hunting areas, fishing permits, and an inability to steward the landscape and thereby maintain a living cultural relationship with the land. This point about living and ongoing is really important to remember too when we're talking about decolonizing environmental education. Because again, you know, Native nations, we don't just exist in the past, we exist in the present, and we're living, breathing cultures that continue to maintain these relationships with place. Next slide. So then in her article, she goes into stages of decolonization, and she talks about rediscovery and recovery in terms of relearning and reinvigorating Native histories and traditions, and mourning. We have to go through a period of mourning. And then she talks about dreaming in terms of integrating the rediscovery and recovery of traditional history and knowledge with mourning to create contemporary institutions that reflect this history and culture and aspirations as distinct survivors of colonialism. And then she talks about commitment as people making a united decision to pursue a particular goal, and action, meaning that our actions should be regenerative rather than just reacting to the system of settler colonization. So we can go on to the next slide. She says that decolonization focuses specifically on countering the devaluation of Indigenous identity, knowledge, and lifeways that came with colonization. When we get to the end of my presentation, I have some do's and don'ts up on a chart, and I think that the do's and don'ts are about this countering the devaluation of Indigenous identity and countering the erasure of Indigenous peoples. And then she talks about healing as an emotional and spiritual process, which includes conscious and holistic recovery, recognition and rebuilding within Native individual families, communities, and nations. And then finally, the role of governance, the role of the state in defining territories to establish authority, and the ways in which marginalized groups have actively resisted the state's criminalization of their resource practices. Okay, next slide. And I think this quote just gets to the heart of what our work is here at this point in time. The task of a liberated nation is to understand global systems of domination as manifested in intertwined hierarchies, like male, female, white, non-white, Christian, non-Christian, and respond with a system that rejects this hierarchy, is built on cultural identities and values, and is ultimately empowering for its people. So now let's go on, as we near the end of our time together, to, again, this concept of intersectionality and how do we meaningfully engage with Native nations. So I just have a list of do's and don'ts here. Do learn the names of the Native nations on whose lands you live and work. And don't wait until you need something from local Native nations to learn about or engage with them. I can't tell you how many times, we've been called out of the blue by well-meaning environmentalists who want us to show up and do a blessing at their event. But it's never occurred to them that perhaps they should have invited us to be involved in the planning of the event, or perhaps they should have reached out and asked us if they should even hold the event. And so it's very important that you start this relationship building as early on as possible in the work that you do. And that gets to the second point, which is do reach out early and often and in multiple ways. Email, phone call, social media, tabling at community events, arrange meeting with tribal councils. And the don't on this is don't be offended or discouraged if you don't get a response the first, second, or even fifth time you've reached out. If you reflect back on the slides I showed earlier and this concept of intergenerational trauma that Beth Rose Middleton talks about, there's a long, several hundred-year history of violence and exploitation and land theft and subjugation. And so it's not easy to build these relationships. Building relationships take time. And so, just keep at it is the advice that I would give. And don't be discouraged if it takes a while before you actually, are able to have a meeting with someone from a tribal community. Do invite Native leaders and environmental educators to participate in your events and your event planning. Don't limit your ask to inviting Native people to do a blessing or perform some other opening without also inviting a more in-depth presentation. Often when folks do try to engage with Native peoples, they really limit that engagement to a very sort of one-dimensional notion of what it means to be Native. And the fourth point I think is very important, particularly when we're talking about environmental education as a profession. And that is, if you are soliciting input from Native nations, if you are asking Native folks to come out and do a lecture or participate in something to share their expertise and their traditional ecological knowledge, make sure to fairly compensate Native presenters and educators. Don't assume that Native knowledge is available for extraction without compensation. I had an experience several years ago where I was putting on this convening, and most of the speakers were Native, but there was one speaker that was non-Native, and that speaker was a graduate student, and they asked for compensation that basically was just amounted to a per diem and what a flight and their travel expenses would cost. Interestingly, they were the only person that requested that compensation. But we certainly weren't going to compensate the one non-Native presenter and none of the Native presenters. So what we did is we just compensated all of the presenters at the same rate that the non-Native graduate student had requested. And it was eye-opening and heartbreaking at the same moment, because after the event, I was approached by one of the Native elders who was there, and he had tears in his eyes, and he was thanking me, and he said that this was more money than anyone had ever paid him to speak at an event. And I was just heartbroken, because what we paid them was just what the basic costs were to cover their being there and participating. And the idea that he'd been this leader and this expert and was an elder, and that no one had ever even paid him just what the basic coverage of his cost to get somewhere was just appalling. But unfortunately, it was also not surprising, because that kind of thing happens all the time. And when you reflect on the history of colonization and land divestment, many Native people are in a very economically disenfranchised position today. So again, I can't underscore that point enough. Don't assume that just because Native folks care about the environment and our culture, that our knowledge should be valued at less than other folks' knowledge. So next slide. Do invest in the long run and plan for long-term engagement with Native nations by asking how you or an organization can support the priorities identified by Indigenous communities. Remember, it's not all about whatever priorities or missions your organization or your program has going. It's likely that the Native folks you want to engage with have a whole set of priorities and strategies in place as well. And so it's important to check in and see how you can support those efforts, rather than just asking for Native support of what you're doing. And don't assume that you already know what Native nations' priorities are, or that your priorities and theirs are the same, because both care about the environment. Do familiarize yourself with concepts like traditional ecological knowledge and recognize that Indigenous systems of science and culture have been deeply rooted in an ideology of sustainability since time immemorial. And don't operate from the perspective that Western-based science is the only science or always the best ideology for long-term sustainability and health of our planet. And finally, on the do's and don'ts, do your part to make sure that agencies and organizations are working with and accountable to the Native nations on whose lands they live and work. And don't participate in the erasure of Indigenous communities in your environmental educational work. So just make sure that you do your homework, you find out whose land you're on, you find ways to build relationships with those nations, and that we all work together to decolonize and to end this myth of the empty land and the vanishing Indian. Next slide. So I see I've taken up almost all of our time. These are the pre-submitted questions that I wanted to quickly try and go through, and then hopefully we'll have some time for any questions that may have come up during the course of this webinar. So the first question, I'm hoping that I answered a bit through the presentation. I was wondering if you could discuss what decolonization means to you and your organization, and how you see environmental education both in and outside of Indigenous communities working towards maintaining and restoring Indigenous sovereignty and or repatriating land. I think, you know, the key piece of that is first find out and just always remember that you are on some Native Nations land, and keeping that concept present in all of your engagements so that when something comes up, when maybe land comes up for sale, you can reach out to the local tribes and you can ask them if, you know, they would like maybe access to that land, or if they would like to, you know, come in and help purchase it, or whatever. Just making sure that Indian people are present in all those conversations and present and invited to be at the table in a meaningfully non-tokenized way. And the next question, how can Los Angeles students of color with Indigenous roots in the US and other countries engage authentically with currently identified US Indigenous students? And what are key frameworks or teachings to look at when trying to create a class or unit around connection to or views of the environment? So, you know, again, with that point, particularly in talking about Los Angeles, definitely whoever submitted this question, please reach out to me by email. I can definitely put you in touch with folks from the Tongva Nation, who is the Native nation that most of Los Angeles is in their ancestral territory. In terms of specifics, I'm not sure what age group of students they were talking about in this question, but I can definitely offline provide resources once I have a little more information about sort of what age of students we're talking about. I think one of the best ways to engage is to bring in folks from the local Native nations. Because it's much more effective always, I think, to have somebody there in person and talking and sharing culture than just reading a book. And the last question that's on here, what sort of advice would you give for an all-tribal organization currently writing a curriculum for Native youth, educating them on their Pueblo experience at Standing Rock? We recently, one of Sacred Places Institute's projects is the Native American Youth Coastal Ambassador Program. And so we partner with Sherman Indian School in Riverside and Los Angeles Waterkeeper to do coastal and marine education programs with these Native youth. And we recently had an event where we invited some of the water protectors from Standing Rock to talk to the youth. And what was most effective in my observation of that was the way that the water protectors encouraged the Native youth who go to Sherman to connect it back to their own tribal cultural experiences. And so I think specifically to this question, I'm not sure which Pueblo it is that you're referring to, but I think that being able to connect what happened at Standing Rock, particularly around water, to whatever issues are related to water in your own tribal community is really key. At least when I was observing the interaction between the students from Sherman and the water protectors, the students really seemed to light up and get very engaged when they were be able to connect it back to struggles on their own tribal lands. So I think anytime you can do that, it's going to go really far in terms of getting the students interested. And so we have, I think, just a couple of minutes. So I don't know if there are other questions, or I want to turn it back over to you guys now. Or maybe I can read the questions on here. I saw a question for a second and then it went away. So I don't know if somebody else can read them to me, or how we should proceed.
Yeah, sure. Thank you again, Angela, for such a great presentation. It was really interesting. Let's see. We have one or two questions that I'll read, and any questions we don't get to, we will definitely post on EE Pro. And Angela has been nice enough to agree to answer your questions on EE Pro if we don't get to them today. So our first question. How do you navigate the Western culture of sharing of information and public knowledge versus the Indigenous culture of private traditions not to open share?
I think that's a really good question. And I think the answer to that is you absolutely 100% have to defer to the Native nations on anything that has to do with their culture. Because the history of exploitation and extraction of Native knowledge is so extreme that there's a reason why Native folks tend to be so protective of certain knowledge and culture and information. And so on a moral, ethical, principled basis, you just have to defer to them 100% on that. The other piece of that, I'm not sure what laws are like in other states, but I know that there are federal laws, like you have the Freedom of Information Act, but things that are related to Indigenous cultural sites and archaeological sites are explicitly exempt from Public Records Act requests. And that's the case in California as well. And those laws exist specifically because of the long history of theft of Indigenous resources. There's a whole profession basically referred to as pot hunters, which is people that would go out and just try to dig up Native remains and funerary objects. And I mean, there's still scandals that emerge, every once in a while over somebody selling or attempting to sell Native artifacts and even Native remains on eBay or on other, buy and sell trade sites. And so, there's reasons why Native peoples have certain information off limits and certain confidentiality rules. And I think you just have to defer to them on that, is the answer.
Great, thanks, Angela. How about, what is your working definition of sacred?
I don't know that you can have a single working definition of sacred. I think that, and this, is a concept that I think you see conflict around when Native people are trying to protect places, because you'll get the sort of Western worldview that says, yeah, but just tell me where it ends. Just draw a boundary over what's sacred, or can we build 5 miles out, or what about 3 miles out? And it's just and then you'll get Native folks saying it's all sacred. And so it's a very challenging difference of opinion to work through. And so in terms of a working definition of sacred, I think that it's really up to each individual community. And, like I said, there's 111 federally recognized tribes and 50 unrecognized tribes in California. There's close to 600 recognized Native American nations throughout the United States and several hundred more unrecognized. And each of those nations has distinct cultures and languages and histories. And so like in some cultures, you don't talk about someone after they've died. It's off limits, it's taboo. There are some Native nations that don't want ancestral remains repatriated because they won't have anything to do with that around the taboos around death. And then there are other cultures that have a very different perspective. And so again, when it comes to what's sacred, I think it's just going to be really important to engage directly with the Native nations on whose lands and waters you're living and working, and have that conversation and figure it out together, is my answer to that question.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. We really appreciate it. And I just want to reiterate that we encourage all of you to head to EE Pro to continue this discussion. Once again, Angela was gracious enough to provide us with her email address if you have any questions for her. And you can also catch her on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion EE Pro group. You can find and share the recording of this webinar on EE Pro. Again, we'll be posting that in EE Pro, and we'll also be sending a link to the recording to your emails, so keep an eye out for that. And just to reiterate, we're really going to drill this in. You can join special interest groups on EE Pro to engage in discussions. We'll be continuing discussions on this particular topic in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group. And please stay tuned for future webinars. In March, we will be holding a two-parter with Andy Goodman, who will be presenting why bad presentations happen to good causes. And just as a reminder, this webinar is part of our monthly webinar series. We typically host webinars on the 4th Tuesday of every month. Future topics include hope in the environmental movement and civic engagement. But please reach out to us if you have any ideas or feedback for future speakers or presentations. And if you have a minute, we'll be copying and pasting a link to a webinar survey in the chat box. You are also going to receive this link in the follow-up email. We'd love to get your feedback on how you're feeling about our webinars and our speakers, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for joining us.